in Luke chapter 15 and in Matthew chapter 18, there is a parable that Jesus tells, two very short parables that he tells in two places. And so each time what he's saying is basically there's this shepherd who has a flock with 100 sheep. One of them goes missing. He leaves the 99 to go find the one and recover that one lost sheep. And in both places, he's using that parable to describe a slightly different thing. But that parable has been used in the church world quite often to justify an idea. And the idea is this, that it is so important to reach the lost for Christ that we need to abandon, as it were, the 99. Like, they don't matter, go get the lost one. And I've heard pastors say this to that degree, like, they don't matter, go get the one that's lost. And so there's this, they've used this parable to justify that, but I'm going to argue today that actually that parable is teaching the exact opposite. And so it's a real shame, and I would even say a sin, if we do that. We've got to be really careful. The lost, of course, are so important. People who don't know the Lord, we need to reach out to these people, and we need to take the gospel to them. So I'm not saying that, but I am saying that this idea that somehow we should, the church needs to be sacrificed for this is just wrong. So this is the thing. Let's take a look at it for a minute here today. Something to note about the parable is that in both parables, in neither case is the shepherd sacrificing the sheep that are with him in order to get the one that's lost. He is not saying that they will be done away with for this purpose. However, there are many pastors who have got this idea, grow at any cost, and if we have to lose a few people along the way, that's okay. As if the shepherd in the parable had said, if I lose a few sheep here, that's fine. At least I'm going to get the one. And that is not what Jesus taught. It would be contrary to what Jesus taught. Jesus was actually trying to teach that a lost sheep is an important thing. Losing any sheep, even one, is a bad thing. And so if the shepherd had come back and he had lost some sheep from the 99, he would have then went looking for those sheep as well, because every one sheep matters. And so if you have a church and you have 99 people in your church and one lost, it would be a violation of this parable to say that if we have to lose a few of these sheep in order to reach the... No. Keep them all. Keep all 99 and find the lost sheep. And it's worth noting, in both cases, it's a lost sheep that we're talking about here. We're talking about a sheep that wandered away from the group. And so to take this and just automatically decide that it means people who've never been in the church, it's a bit of a stretch. And so we got to be careful about this, right? The shepherd knows the sheep that's missing. He can tell the sheep's missing because he counted. And, I've got one that's missing. I'm going after that sheep. And he knew who the sheep was because the shepherd would have even known the sheep by name, according to the way Jesus talked about himself. And so to use this as if it's talking about the unknown lost that are out there in the world in unknown places, and we just have to wire our church in such a way that we're going to reach them at all costs. And if there's people in the church who won't get on board, then get off board. That is a violation. That is not shepherding. And Jesus called us to be shepherds. And he says we should be this kind of shepherd who say, we'll leave these sheep here and we'll go find the one that we know is lost. And so reach out to that person. There's a deliberateness to this. And so that's just a mistake. The other thing is that not only did the shepherd not sacrifice the sheep, the shepherd didn't even abandon them. Right? There was no abandoning occurring here. It says in the Luke text, I believe, that they left them. The shepherd leaves them in the open field, and in the Matthew text it says leaves them in the mountains. But in both cases, the idea is he led them to a place that he knew, and he leads them, and as the shepherds would have done in those days, into a place. He wouldn't have led them into the jungle where they could be preyed upon, or into the thicket, or into a river. He left them. Here's the good pasture land. I've got them taken care of. Now I'm going to leave them there to graze as I go find this sheep. Or I've got them in the mountains. They're above the immediate threats. I'm going to leave them here so that I can go find this sheep. And so the idea wasn't that he was abandoning them, because in both cases he finds a sheep and returns with the sheep to the 99, all 99. And so when we understand this parable well, I think we need to understand that a good shepherd does not abandon his sheep either. He may leave them in a safe place until he can get the lost one, because the lost one matters. But he doesn't abandon them. And then if you look at the greater context surrounding these texts, you'll get a bigger picture of the story. So in the Luke text, he he talks about his woman with the coin, and then he talks about the prodigal son, the famous prodigal son story. And at the end of that story, the older brother, who's kind of bitter that the younger son got all this attention, the father rebukes him for his bitterness, but he doesn't cast him out of the house. And the father doesn't lack any care or concern for the brother's feelings. He just helps correct the brother's feelings, and he tells him, no, we should rejoice over this newfound lost person. But he says the statement to him, everything I have is yours. You are always with me. And there's this statement of embrace there, like, son, you're my son. And you're with me, and all this is yours. So change your attitude. But he doesn't reject that son in favor of the new one. And so we need to understand that. And then the Matthew text, it's completely surrounded by text talking about the danger of allowing these young Christians to be lost, or these little children to be lost into sin, and that it would be better for woe to you if you're the stumbling block that causes someone to sin. And if someone asks for forgiveness, you should forgive them. And then he talks about church discipline, and he's right in the middle of all that. He's got this parable. The idea is that the church cohesiveness, the whole church, is important. And the point of the parable is not, well, if there's some of the church is not going to, then no, get rid of those guys. That's not the point. The point is the whole church matters, even this one little one that's wandered away. So let's go find this little one. Even if I have to leave these ones alone for a little while, they're not abandoned. They're not sacrificed. I'm going to get that one. See, God loves His church. He loves every person in His church. He loves the lost, but He doesn't love the lost to the exclusion of the found. He loves the found. And so we need to understand that it's not win the lost at any cost. It's win the lost, but it's not at any cost. There are some costs that simply are too high. And God does not endorse us abandoning and destroying the faith of maybe weak Christians in our church just because they're a little stubborn or cold or hard to get there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he's talking about eating food that's been sacrificed to idols or whatnot, and he's talking about a weaker brother whose faith isn't developed. And in verse 11 and 12, he says, for through your knowledge, the knowledge that you have that the sacrificing to an idol doesn't matter, he says, if through your knowledge he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died, and so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. I mean, that's a pretty grim thought that he's saying, even if there's a person in your church whose faith hasn't developed enough, they haven't figured out all these things yet, and they're weaker, you figured them out, but they haven't yet, and you go ahead anyways and violate their conscience, you are ruining them, someone for whom Christ died for them. You're not just sinning against them, you're actually sinning against Christ Himself. And so this idea that we should sacrifice the church in order to grow it, no. Now, if there's somebody in the church who's not even Christian holding everything back, well, that's a different story. But if these are true believers that maybe they just haven't seen it the same as you. Maybe they haven't seen the light, or maybe they're scared or whatever it is. But we're all just sheep, aren't we? We all have our faults, and we need to be patient as shepherds of God's flock. And really, I guess I would say that if you can't lead your brothers and sisters in the pursuit of the lost, if you try but you just can't get them there, then rather than sacrificing them or abandoning them, just do it yourself at least. You yourself at least go out and find that sheep. You leave them in the open pasture and go out and find that sheep, and then come back to them and make sure you tend to the whole flock. Do not build your own church, because if you're doing that, then all you're doing is building your own work at the cost of God's work. That's something we should never do.